Hey everyone, so for today's story time I'm going to be reading the last two chapters of George's Marvellous Medicine. Chapter 14, Marvellous Medicine number 4. Back in the kitchen once again, George with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. Boil it up again, cried Mr. Cranky. Boil it and stir it. George boiled it and stirred it. You'll never get it right, said Mrs. Cranky. Don't forget you don't just have to have the same things, but you've got to have exactly the same amount of those things. And how can you possibly do that? You keep out of this, cried Mr. Cranky. We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You see if we haven't. This was George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and when it had boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful of it out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. You're going to have some mighty queer chickens around here if you go on like this, she said. Dish it out, George, cried Mr. Cranky. Give a spoonful to that one over there. He pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and held up the spoon with the new medicine in it. Chick, chick, he said. Try some of this. The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. Then he went, peck. Ouch, it said. Then a funny whistling noise came out of his beak. Watch it grow, shouted Mr. Cranky. Don't be too sure, said Mrs. Cranky. Why is it whistling like that? Keep quiet, woman, cried Mr. Cranky. Give it a chance. They stood there, staring at the brown hen. It's getting smaller, George said. Look at it. Dad, it's shrinking. And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. Chapter 15. Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and she shouted, What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea? No eggs and bacon? No buttered toast? I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away. Let George get it, the lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted a cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Ho ho, she cried. Ha ha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you don't think to bring one to your poor old grandma? I always knew you were a selfish pig. No, Grandma, George said. That isn't... Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it up here a minute. No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you. Now, you're going against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, no, Grandma, George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't. You're not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's Marvellous. Everything's George's round here, shouted Grandma. George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. Lovely tea? No, the other two cried. No, no, no. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine. Number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did that one little brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. "She'll feel better after she's let off a little bit of steam anyway," Mr. Cranky said. "She's going to blow up," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "Her boiler's going to burst." "Stand clear," Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. "Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police. Man the hose pipes." "Too late," said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. "Grandma!" shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother!" "Run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George!" Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mr. Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half a minute she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it had always had. Her eyes, no bigger than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's still getting smaller. And by golly she was." When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?" "You can't," said Mr. Cranky. "She's had 50 times the right amount. I must stop her." Mrs. Cranky wailed, "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happens to you if you get grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes Mrs. Cranky kept wandering round with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quickly. And by lunchtime she was saying, "Ah, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," Mr. Cranky said, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. The end. Hope you enjoyed. Bye.